Hello friends and comrades, and welcome to another video. In this one I will be discussing the possibility of a Russian declaration of war, as well as what would happen afterwards. And by that I would say what I expect the Russians to plan. Whether or not they will succeed, that will heavily depend on their ability to fight and wage war and so on. Uh, However, it is my expectations for what they would plan. So don't judge me if it happens or not. It is based on my assumptions and my educated guess. So, first, there's this tweet by The Serious Report. It is a podcast run by a British guy, and he has been running this podcast for many years, and he said a lot of sensible things throughout the years. For example, in 2019, he mentioned that BRICS would create their own currency and a lot of other things that actually happens in this year. And well, they predicted the future pretty well. Now, he says that there are, and I stress, rumors that Russia will make an official announcement that they are at war with Ukraine in the next few weeks. So, of course, this is a rumor. However, with my trust towards this reporter or podcast guy, I expect them to take this rumor from a realistic person, from a trustworthy person. However, the fact that it is a rumor means that it isn't guaranteed. But I think it is very likely that this will happen, especially after the successful Ukrainian counterattack in Kharkiv. So, I read an article where I'll link it in the description, where it was back in May. They discussed the possibility of Russian increase in manpower through reservists and conscripts. So generally, they mentioned that Russian reservists and conscripts are poorly trained and aren't ready for battle or war. However, that could have changed since the war began. With how serious the war has become, I think they may have upped their efforts in training new conscripts and reservists and so on. And I think generally they would be better prepared now than they were a year ago. I also believe that they also mentioned in that article that the Russians upped their interest in getting new reservists and new conscripts by giving them financial incentives, meaning that they were preparing for this war a year ago through increasing the incentives of Russian civilians entering the conscript and reservist forces. So generally, my expectations is that they will mobilize up to 500,000 people, and that number is based on the fact that this is how much they can achieve with 250,000. Then with triple that, they will be able to essentially match the Ukrainian manpower, which would allow them to create a full front line that is to their advantage because they have more firepower and more equipment than the Ukrainians. So unless the West ups their sending of weapons and their equipment to Ukrainians, the Ukrainians will be outgunned and outmanned if Russia does mobilize 500,000 people. As for the training, I'm not really sure how that would match up, so I'm not going to talk about that as that is gray area. However, what I expect the Russians to do in such a scenario is that they will, first of all, they would send a lot of troops to the front line, meaning they would supply the Donbas region as well as Crimea and Zaporizhia with a lot of troops. I'm not sure their supply capabilities to Kherson is. However, if they're able to, they will also send more troops there. This is to hold the front line and keep it stable until their next offensive. And then after that, I would suggest they would put around 400,000 people. So they have 250,000 soldiers. So they would increase that by 150,000. Then they would add 200,000 to Belgorod and the Bryansk area, as well as eastern Belarus. And then they would have 150,000 soldiers at the western Belarus. So their plans would most likely be to encircle Sumy from these areas, and cut it off from supplies, as they also advance from the north of Kharkiv towards Poltava. As if we look at the supply map, you can actually see that most supplies go through either Sumy or Poltava from the north, meaning if they manage to go to Poltava and reach it, they can essentially cut off all Ukrainian supplies from towards Kharkiv from the west. At the same time, the forces that they've added to Zaporizhia will be able to launch an offensive here, which will allow them to reach Zaporizhia. So with a focus on these two areas, the final area would be around Dnipro, where I expect the Russians, either if they find a lot of success, to rush straight there from Zaporizhia, and if they get stalled early on, they will launch an air campaign to essentially blow up the bridge. This would cut off all Ukrainian supplies in this whole pocket and put them in a similar situation to the Ukrainians, to the Russians in Kherson. Now, after that, they would also launch an offensive to the west of Ukraine to essentially cut off all the supplies towards all of Ukraine from the west. This would prevent any further weapons from arriving to Ukraine, except for here in the southern part from Romania. However, there's also the issue here that Russia keeps blowing up the bridges here in the south, and with them controlling Transnistria, it will be difficult for them to send weapons through Moldova. So essentially, the situation would be a full cut-off of Western supplies, so the Ukrainians would have to deal with that situation, and at the same time, they would have a numerical superiority and outgun the Ukrainians. So that is what I would do if I was the Russians and I declared war on Ukraine. So what can the Ukrainians do to counteract this situation? They would have to, first of all, request a lot of weapons from the West, as they have been. They would need thousands of tanks, of multi-launch rocket systems, hundreds of HIMARS, a lot of aircraft, F-16, F-22, F-25, whatever the models are. I don't remember because I have been focusing a lot on the Su-25 and Su series and the MiG series, as these are the ones that have been used, not the NATO planes throughout this war. So generally, I would say they would need a lot of NATO airplanes, they would need a lot of anti-air systems, and they would need a lot of artillery systems, as well as heavy equipment like tanks and IFVs and BMPs, as this is what they need to conduct offensives. If they don't have this, they will not be able to counterattack, and for example, an area like Kherson will be under Russian control. However, with this, they will be able to essentially counteract operations like the one here. If they had the equipment, they would be able to launch an offensive and do the hammer and anvil tactic, where they cut off the Russian forces and prevent them from retreating. The idea here is that they only need to attack from the east, because if the Russians advance down here, they will be able to cut them off. If the Russians try to push westwards, they will be reaching Poland, and they will not be able to do anything there, or Article 5 will be launched. And if they try to go towards the east, then the Ukrainian forces will be there. So this is a very risky maneuver. However, it is necessary for the Russians to be able to win in this conflict. So they know the Russians must go through that area. Therefore, the Ukrainians need to prepare heavy defenses in that area to prepare to counteract the Russian offensive. Other than that, they would need to strengthen Kharkiv and send a lot of troops into this area to counteract any offensives that they reach there from Belgorod. As Belgorod and Kursk, especially these two cities, are heavily militarized cities, and they have a lot of troops there, meaning that generally, if the Russians mobilize, they'll send a lot of troops there, as they are able to handle a large amount of military hardware. And finally, they need to essentially create a heavy defense here next to the Donbass. They already have great defenses here in the Donbass region, as shown by the lack of Russian advances. And now with the control over Izium as well, they need to hold this line heavily, as this is what keeps their supplies flowing towards this area. If the Russians manage to break through here in Zaporizhia, they will be able to cut off most of the supplies reaching the east of Ukraine. So if they want to hold on to the east of Ukraine, they'll need to protect the river and Zaporizhia especially. And then the final front, the Odessa front, they will need to completely mine the area similarly to what they did and early on, as this would prevent any naval invasion from the Russian side. And they need to keep their missile defense systems at high alert to prevent any Russian ships of closing in to help the bombardment of southern Ukraine. This will allow the Ukrainians to focus only on this one front, which is the south. If the Ukrainians manage to take back Kherson before the Russian counteroffensive, they will be able to completely focus all of their defenses here in the east, which will allow them to hold much better than if they have split their forces to also cover the Kherson area. So, step 1 for the Ukrainians, get Kherson back. Step 2, prepare for the significant areas as Brest, which is western Belarus, and Lviv area, defend that, and strengthen their Zaporizhia Izium line. Let's call it that, Zaporizhia Izium line. And finally, strengthen Kharkiv to be able to counteract any offensive in the east. If the Russians advance here in the north, it would be completely useless, and they can just guerrilla warfare similar to the start of the war, where they just kept attacking the supply lines, and that will eventually attrition the Russian forces into retreat. So generally, focus on Kharkiv, Kherson, and Lviv, and the Ukrainians should be fine. And for the Russians, you need to put everything you have, because anything less, you're doomed to fail. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.